In the early hours of Tuesday morning, the bombs began to fall once again. The ceasefire in Gaza, which had lasted not quite 2 months, was over. Once again, social media began to fill up with the images of families fleeing the missiles, young children on life support or past needing it. Given that no international journalists are allowed into Gaza, sometimes it feels difficult to just hear what's happening on the ground. That's what we wanted to do when we brought Arwa Damon on the podcast right after her last trip into Gaza. What she told us was so important to hear as much as it was difficult, because without hearing from the people on the ground, we can't easily conceive of what is happening. But I've been wondering if, away from the devastation, there's a bigger rupture taking place. This is something several intellectuals have begun exploring, that for all the relatively small size of Gaza comparatively, how tiny the space of land is in which this huge destruction is happening, the political and social, even moral ramifications are so much larger. Gaza to these thinkers represents not merely a war that has continued for 16 months, but a fundamental change in the way we think about the world. For one of these thinkers, Omar El Akkad, the Gaza conflict is exposing something bigger. For him, it's showing liberalism as a fiction, a fairy tale those who benefit from that establishment not just want, but need to tell themselves. Omar is an Egyptian-Canadian journalist and writer. His first novel, American War, drew favourable comparisons to the work of Cormac McCarthy and Philip Roth in its depiction of a dystopian alternative America, while his 2021 novel, What Strange Paradise, won the Gillip Prize. His new book, One Day, Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, is a non-fiction treatise on the war in Gaza. In the book, Omar reflects on how the war in Gaza shattered the faith he himself had held in the liberal establishment, really in the purported values that America says it believes in, and in which he so wanted to believe. I brought Omar onto the podcast to discuss not what is happening in Gaza, something we have explored a lot on the podcast, but how the Gaza war has changed something irrevocably in his relationship with what is now his home. This was a difficult conversation, and at times personal, emotional, while getting to the core of what Omar believes is the problem with today's world. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. Omar El Akkad, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
We should probably start with your tweet, because it's what started you on the path to writing this book. On October 25th, 2023, about 3 weeks into the start of the Gaza war, you responded to a video of a Palestinian journalist walking through a devastated Gaza. And it's a curious juxtaposition, because you have this blue Mediterranean sky and all around there's just devastation and silence, and the only thing you can hear is the anxious breath of the journalist as he's walking. And you wrote, "One day, when it's safe, when there's no personal downside to calling a thing what it is, when it's too late to hold anyone accountable, everyone will have always been against this." The words of those tweets are now on the front of a book that runs to a couple of hundred pages. And I wondered if, I know you've said in the past that you had started writing the book even before you wrote the tweet, but I wonder if part of the book was a way of processing some of the ideas that are encapsulated in that tweet.
Yeah, I often talk about writing as my first avenue of retreat. When the world doesn't make sense to me, I tend to sit with that on the page. And so that's what I had been doing. I'm not much of a social media guy. Back then I used to tweet about once a month. I've stopped doing it entirely now. And I have no idea why that tweet in particular gained the traction that it did. But independent of that, I was sort of sitting with these ideas of what the hell my place was in the West, because I didn't know anymore. A lot of the load-bearing beams institutionally and narratively that I had sort of believed in for a lot of my life were coming apart in front of my eyes. And so it was only after the first draft of the book was completed, months later, that one of my editors suggested repurposing the tweet as the title. And it sort of made sense given the context of the book. But those two things began fairly independently.
Do you think that part of the reason the tweet caught fire is because you were taking a historical perspective on something that is so rooted in so often it's reported in the day-to-day, There's the sign, you might have seen this at some of the Gaza protests, that says, if you've ever wondered what you would have done during slavery, you're doing it right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a particularly smart person. I tend to work in terms of pattern recognition most of the time. And I was thinking of this pattern that repeats itself over and over again in distant history and more recent history, which is that if you're not personally connected to an atrocity, the safest thing you can do amidst that atrocity is keep your head down and wait.
If it doesn't affect you personally.
Yeah, the predominant systems we live under are systems of perpetual taking, capitalism, colonialism. These things are insatiable. And the first orders of taking are the most concrete. You take the land, you take the resources, you take the lives of people who get in the way. But as you move further along that spectrum of taking, the theft becomes more abstract. And towards the end, you reach the taking of narrative. You know, I write for a living, which means that I spend a lot of my time going to these literary festivals. And I don't know what it's like in other parts of the world, but in North America, almost every one of these literary festival panels begins with a land acknowledgement. Somebody comes up to the stage and says, you know, we're on the unceded indigenous territory of the Anishinaabe people. And we are several hundred years too late to stop the genocide that created the conditions whereby this person has to come up and give this acknowledgement. Is there much doubt in my mind that there's going to be, towards the end of my life, a poetry reading in Tel Aviv that begins with a land acknowledgement? Not really. But again, I'm working on sort of pattern recognition more than anything else.
But isn't the land recognition part interesting for your argument? Because the sentence that says we accept that we are on unceded land never ends with, and we're trying to give it back.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, this notion of what it is you're taking. And what you're taking in that moment, I think, is narrative. When I came of age, when I was about 19 when the September 11th attacks happened. So my adult life basically took place in the War on Terror years and the sort of aftermath of that. And again, I'm thinking of patterns. I'm thinking of the first acceptable narratives during that time, which was, as it always is the case in these situations, it was silence. It was you say nothing. Again, you keep your head down. But then slowly over time, that door begins to sort of pry open. But what are the first stories that sort of come in through that door? It's short story collections by former Marines who are writing about how sad it made them to have to kill all those brown people.
The kill and cry genre.
Exactly. And so you see this, right? And honestly, there's not much doubt in my mind that in the coming years, once international journalists are allowed into Gaza, you're going to start to see these very beautifully written, devastating reports about the true scope and scale of the atrocity. And the thing that's going to distinguish them from the reports that are coming out from Palestinian journalists and have been coming out for the last year and a half is that they were written by white Westerners. That's going to be the defining aspect there. And so you sort of see this happening over and over again, and there's an element of deep, deep frustration at knowing that there exists a kind of narrative trajectory that you're following in real time, and you know what's at the end of it, but you still have to sort of watch everyone go through the motions.
You do sometimes hear that, right, about the journalism in Gaza. They say, well, there are no journalists allowed into Gaza. When, I mean, it's not true. There are journalists in Gaza. We have tried to publish as many of them as we can. That there are real journalists on the ground. It's just they don't happen to be white and Western, and so they are not believed.
Yeah, and I mean, it's incredibly effective. And not just in the sense that you can safely ignore what these people are reporting and what they're risking and sometimes giving their lives to report, but also any action taken against them is considered permissible. Because again, all you have to do is say, Hamas linked or whatever it is the narrative demands. And I'm on the boards of some of these organizations in this part of the world that are supposed to defend journalists. And the silence has been deafening. The silence has been absolutely deafening. This is the one thing your organization is supposed to do. The one thing. And at a moment where the violence against these journalists is more rampant than it has ever been in my lifetime, what is coming from most of these institutions? A deafening silence.
Have you been struck, history sometimes gives us parallels, have you been struck by the difference in the way that journalists in Gaza are treated versus the way that journalists in Ukraine are treated? We very rarely hear about the Kiev-linked journalists.
I wish I could say I was struck by it. I really do. I really do. But I think anytime you see a subset of a more overarching kind of racist hierarchy, it's very difficult to separate it into its own components. I mean, we know what this is. We know what this is. The same way we know it when it relates to refugees from different parts of the world.
But isn't, you say you know what this is, but isn't part of your book a discovery of what this is? A kind of rupture with what you thought previously?
You know, it's interesting because the book kind of walks in through the door pretending to want to pick a fight. It's a book that appears to throw a lot of punches, and I get that, and people are going to punch back. But to me, the defining aftertaste of the book is a kind of deep uncertainty, a deep personal uncertainty, because there's nothing in this book that is indicted or interrogated or autopsied in which I am not deeply complicit. And so I think the thing for me that is an avenue of discovery is not so much that there exists this incredibly racist hierarchy. I think I knew that consciously or subconsciously for a long time. It's that I can no longer tether myself to a particular ideological orientation that allows me to be oblivious to this. And that, for me, has been the real difficulty.
This has been something that we have discussed with, let's say, Western Palestinians a lot, Palestinians who are citizens of the Western countries. And it is something incredibly difficult because, as you have pointed out previously, I think you certainly have a way of phrasing things very nicely. And one of the phrases I've heard you use on interviews is you happen to be from the part of the country away from which the missile is pointed. And so you're from these countries where your taxpayer money is providing the money, the weapons they're sending, and yet at the same time you are against the thing that your government and your money is doing. And it puts you in a strange position, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've said it time and again, and I firmly believe this. I'm killing those kids, right? I'm doing that. That's my tax money. And not only am I doing this, I'm being endlessly rewarded for my complicity and my capacity to be oblivious to that suffering. The other day I got this email from someone in the UK who was trying to reach me, and the email said something like, I heard you on Channel 4 and you sounded so calm and so gentle. And I was thinking
Right.
about this because I don't know if I'm a calm or gentle person, but I do know that I've been conditioned over the years to know exactly how uncalm and ungentle an Arab Muslim guy named Omar can be before the limits of the imagination on what I'm capable of become unlimited. And so over time, you become conditioned to know that you can't get too angry. I mean, I've spent the last year and a half of my life watching footage of murdered children. I'm really, really angry. But I also know that the second I let that go, the second I sort of lose control, the second I stop being gentle or calm or whatever it is, I'm done. That's all a kind of conditioning.
Yeah, I mean, you're framing that as a response to the way you as an Arab are perceived in the West. But it could also be to do with your professional training as a journalist, that there's a level of impartiality you need to have.
It could be. And certainly I came up in that mode. I came up in the mode that if I'm interviewing you and you say that the moon is made out of cheese, and I interview someone else who says it isn't, I put both those claims in and, let the reader decide sort of thing, which is a certain view of impartiality or neutrality that I think falls apart in the face of plain bad faith. But it certainly could be the case. I agree.
One of the things that I found very interesting about the book was that there are some larger philosophical questions at the heart of it. And I wanted to get to some of those questions. Language forms a big part of how you think about this particular war. I was reading the review of your book in the New York Times, and the word war, we are in the midst of an unfinished Gaza war, restarting Gaza war, never appears in the context of Palestine. I don't know if you realize that. It was only used in the context of historic wars, the Iraq wars and so on. And I thought that actually really demonstrates your point, that these terms, however accurate they are, can only be applied to things from the past.
So I must admit that I don't have the Constitution to read my own reviews, so I haven't read.
Okay, all right.
I haven't read the New York Times one. I'll have to take your word for it on that front.
All right. Well,
I mean, what I do is I sit and think about language. That is essentially the entirety of my professional life. And I think one of the difficulties I've had in the last year and a half is watching how easily language can be deranged, can be used for the exact opposite of what language is supposed to be used for, which is the making of meaning.
So give me an example for the audience of what you mean.
Sure, I'll give you one from this morning. It was a Reuters headline about the new round of slaughter in Gaza, which has just begun as we're taping this. And it was something like, Israeli airstrikes kill 400, ceasefire on the brink. And I thought, someone had to sit down and write that the ceasefire is now on the brink. And I'm not 100% sure if they knew just how honest that headline is, because I think it betrays a central narrative beam of Western coverage of this killing, which is that only one side can break the ceasefire. Only one side can instigate. The other side is just perpetually responding, is perpetually defending itself.
There haven't been any Palestinian airstrikes to break the ceasefire.
There is no ceasefire truly broken until the perpetual instigators break it. And once you're in that narrative framing, it actually imposes a very clarifying, even if completely fraudulent, kind of certainty over the event, right? This is stuff that's not done from a place of obliviousness. When a TV anchor says that a bullet found its way into a van at an Israeli checkpoint and hit a 4-year-old young lady, they know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing.
6-year-old child moves in front of Israeli bullet kind of thing.
Yeah. There's a kind of sense that all of this ugliness is always contained to whatever population it's being done to at any given time. And of course, that's never true. I live in the United States, where bullets are constantly finding their way from the guns of cops to the bodies of Black people. This language is never contained to a specific population. It is endlessly recyclable to be used against whatever vulnerable population it needs to be used against at any given moment.
The reason I think we should keep going with language is that you think that this language, this neutral language that refuses to assign blame to those doing the killing, that really is a way of protecting liberals inside the United States or inside the West. So you write, the people are killed as though to be killed is the only natural and rightful ordering of their existence. And this language, this isn't your quote, I'm saying this language isn't actually at the service of the more extreme fringes of society. Instead, this is your quote, it is instead the middle, the liberal, well-meaning, easily upset middle that desperately needs the protection that this kind of language provides. Tell me what you mean about the protection that this kind of neutral language affords liberals.
So a few weeks ago, I was driving home from a book event, and I was listening to NPR, the public broadcaster, and there was an interview with this subject matter expert on the issue of Medicare, which the Republican administration, the Trump administration, is trying to cut. They're trying to cut quite severely. And the interviewer said something like, well, you know, there's this Republican lawmaker who says that 50% of the expenditures of Medicare are fraud. What do you say to that? And you could tell that this expert was having a very hard time answering this question because the number is pure fantasy.
It's just fantasy, right?
It has
right.
no relationship with reality. It's completely made up. And so she said something like, look, we have no evidence to suggest that this is the case. When we do research, we find that roughly 5% of all the money is errors, billing errors. And the interviewer then said, well, you say 5%. This Republican lawmaker says 50%. Isn't there a middle ground there?
Right.
And I thought, you know, this is the model, right? This is the centrist model, not just of journalism, but of being in society. And I'm watching it fall apart. I'm watching it fall apart in real time because it is dependent on a kind of overriding good faith that simply isn't there.
But why do you think that language, as it pertains to the Gaza war, why do you think that language protects liberals?
Because it allows them to occupy this mythical, nonsensical center space where you can believe yourself to be above it all. When there is no sort of personal consequence, when there's nothing personally at risk, that is a space that you can occupy. It's the same impulse that allows someone to say, yes, you know, it's sad that all these tens of thousands of kids have been murdered, but you know, the whole thing is so complicated. It's an exit strategy from the work of actually facing a situation as it is. And again, if you have no stake in the game, it is a perfectly reasonable and desirable place to be because it allows you to remain sort of high-minded and considering of all different opinions without actually addressing the situation at all. You know, I live in Portland, right? Portland, every house, you go to neighborhoods where every lawn has a Black Lives Matter sign, and there's not a black family anywhere in that neighborhood, right? It's this notion of what do I want to be perceived to be? I want to be perceived to be someone who considers all sides and rests in the center. Well, good for you, but the center becomes nonsensical in a time of mass atrocity.
What do you hope that those families could do? But I mean, if we're talking about people saying that, oh, it's terrible what's happening in Gaza, but then not going any further than that and taking solace in this kind of middle ground, what are you hoping that they would do more than that?
Become troublesome in a way that I can't quite do because I don't have the currency.
I was about to say this to you with apologies, but I was going to say that you want them to become troublesome in the way that you haven't become troublesome.
In the way that I'm not able to. So what I mean by that is, a few months ago, I was asked to write an op-ed for my old newspaper in Canada. And I said, listen, I'm going to save you some time. You're not going to run this because I'm going to call it a genocide and I'm going to say that Western governments are complicit. And the editor said, you know, you're right. And then a few months later, I was asked to write an op-ed by the same paper. And I said, listen, I'm going to save you some time. You're not going to run this. I'm going to say it's a genocide. I'm going to say Western governments are complicit. And the editor said, go for it. And so I don't know what changed, but something changed. And so I run this op-ed. And all of the comments, not all of them, but a substantial number, just say something like, well, this was written by a guy named Omar El Akkad. Or like, look at the author's name. Or some variant of that. And the implication is clear. Why the hell should we listen to anything by this guy? With this name, with this ethnicity, with this religion? There is a limit on how far I can push because my name's not John Smith.
But Omar, apologies. I mean, we're early in the conversation and I feel like I'm slightly pushing back on you.
No, please.
But this the person who changed their mind, this person and perhaps the editors around them was white.
Oh yeah, something has changed. And for all I know, it's the exchange rate on human life. Maybe enough Palestinians are dead now that I can call it what I've been calling it since October. But none of that changes the fact that if I call my congressperson or my senator and I complain, and someone 2 blocks down who doesn't have my name, who doesn't have my ethnicity, who doesn't have my religion calls and complains, those are not 2 equal complaints. And so the original question you asked me is, what can people do? They can take advantage of their privilege to be troublesome in a way that has very limited effect when I try to do it.
You've certainly gone through an evolution in your thinking from when you were a journalist to where you are now. I mean, you're still a journalist, but I mean, you're now not reporting as much. You're writing and thinking through these ideas. I wanted to interrogate that a little bit. We had Jasmine Al-Gamal on the podcast a few months ago, and I asked her about the fact that she had worked at Guantanamo Bay as a translator and whether or not she thought that she had actually served the occupation. And I wonder if you look back on those years as a journalist with the mainstream press, you covered the war in Afghanistan, you covered the military trials at Guantanamo, and I think you were hoping to find vestiges of this liberal Western order to believe in. But were you not also actively contributing to the polishing of what you now think of as its false veneer?
Oh, I'm sure I was. I mean, the way I think about it is in terms of what you have to tell yourself to believe that what you just described isn't the case. And I was well versed in that, right? I am out here doing reporting, affecting change simply by telling the truth. And I believed all of that. What has changed for me, I think, is the sense that there are absolute moral thresholds that I can't cross in order to continue to believe the things I previously believed. You know, I wish that I could come up with a more profound, erudite way of putting this, but there's something about the slaughter of children that renders everything else moot.
You've been critical of people who are standing on the sidelines at this particular moment. And you've said that you think that because of the scale of it, as you say, it's a rupture in the moral universe, it's important for everybody to be involved and say directly what is happening. Is that a fair assessment of your perspective?
I think so. I think there's something inherently unreasonable about the position I'm taking in the sense that I find it more frustrating to see someone who knows what's going on and says nothing than to see someone who is actively in support of all of this. You know,
but I suppose the reason I bring it up is for 20 years you believed something different and now you've changed your mind. Is it not possible that these people are also believing something different and will change their mind in 20 years?
Oh, absolutely.
Why do you assume
Absolutely.
Why do you assume bad faith on their part?
I don't. I assume self-preservation.
But you said that when you were involved in what I just described as the defense of the empire for those decades, you said that you genuinely believed it. You weren't trying to defend yourself, you genuinely believed it.
Yeah, but there was also an element of self-preservation there in the sense that I was rewarded endlessly for believing it. You know, my career took off as a result.
Right, so it's very helpful to then continue to believe the thing, and you actually do genuinely believe it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the journalism years, right? It's not just the work I did. It's everything from the time that I was 5 years old. You know, if I had to rank the list of attributes that have helped me the most in life.
Okay, let's hear them.
Near the very top of the list would be this accent, would be the fact that I sound like I'm from here, right?
But you are from there.
Oh yeah, and in a cultural sense, I've been oriented towards this part of the world for the majority of my life, and that has been endlessly rewarding. And I can't suddenly pretend that's not the case.
I wanted to talk a little bit about your relationship with the West. For people who don't know, you grew up in Qatar, and then you moved to Canada, and now you're in the United States. That's the outline, right?
Yeah.
Right. And you wrote in the book that the mind outlines better than it shades. England, Canada, the United States, the West, these places, or rather ideas of places, became in my imagination the negative space of all I despised about the Middle East. I'm asking you this because it seems as if you've been on a journey about the, let's say, the West broadly, from a place where you felt that you were very much part of it to a place now where you feel that there's been a rupture.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my publisher in the synopsis describes this book as a breakup letter with the West. And
Right.
I don't know
Right.
that I fully disagree, but I think that the caveat I would put is that institutionally, I think that's true. Over the last year and a half, I've lost so much faith in the load-bearing institutional beams of the Western world, political, academic, cultural. But at the same time, I've been so incredibly inspired by what people are doing individually and in community with one another.
Tell me what you mean about feeling that that these value systems have broken down. What specifically are you talking about?
I think I'm talking about a narrative enterprise that is contradicting itself in real time. And I think this is one of the most frustrating aspects of being a sort of centrist liberal right now, is that you have to create this little compartment where the exact opposite of everything you purport to believe has to exist. It is a horrible thing to bomb a hospital, except in this case where it's good and necessary. Apartheid is a terrible thing, except in this case where it's good and necessary. A population being made to live in an open-air prison for decades as their land is continually stolen is a terrible thing, except in this case. And so when I talk about the load-bearing beams crumbling, I'm talking about the coexistence of the stated kind of ideological position in terms of values, in terms of laws, in terms of norms, and then this glaring counterexample that everybody just kind of has to live with.
Right. This is what I want to get to, because I think this is really intriguing. Because your critique of the West and Western values goes beyond the idea of Palestine as the exception. It goes beyond the idea that that there is a hypocrisy when it comes to Palestine. You actually believe that the very basis of Western values is not real. So this is a quote from your book where you say, a completely malleable thing, this is about Western liberalism, a completely malleable thing whose primary use is not the opposition of evil or administration of justice, but the preservation of existing power.
I mean, I went to Afghanistan and I saw the light armored vehicles. And then years later, I went to cover the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and I saw the light armored vehicles. And I think it's important to really drill down on this point, because it gets to the heart of the kind of thinking of empire in which I am deeply complicit and which I am trying to rid myself of, but
Right.
constantly find myself returning to. Because what I'm talking about here is this idea that when it's being done to the bad people over there, the disposable people over there, the people you don't have to care about, it's always framed as being in this airtight container. Don't worry, this is just happening now and just happening to these people, and it'll all be okay, just look away. And there's two problems with that. The first is, it's never the case that that container is airtight. It's never the case. If you think that Mahmoud Khalil, the guy who just got disappeared out of Columbia University, is going to be the first and last person to whom this is happening, you are out of your mind. It's always a precedent, and it's always going to leak everywhere else, because the entity doing this kind of evil is insatiable. So that's the first part of it. The second part, though, is that, again, by making this argument to you, I am fully engaged in the thinking of empire. Because what I'm actually telling you is, no, you should care about it happening now to these disposable people, to these subhuman people, because soon it's going to happen to somebody who's sufficiently human.
Right, because soon it might happen to you.
Right. What if those pagers were on airplanes? What if the quadcopter was running in the suburbs of Chicago instead of Palestine? And here's the thing. If that quadcopter killed a Palestinian kid and then never killed anyone else again, it would make it no less evil. And so I find myself lured towards this argument that is very compelling, but at the same time, I have to stop myself and say, no, this is exactly what the empire demands. And because I am so marinated in it, I find myself returning to that argument again, which basically boils down to, yes, now it's happening to people who we all consider subhuman, fine, they're far away. But soon it might happen to somebody who actually matters, and that's why you should oppose it. It's not why you...
Yeah, well, that's what the problem with the "if you tolerate this, your children will be next" argument is. That you're not saying that it's a problem now. You're saying just don't tolerate it because it's your kids next.
Yeah, exactly.
In the war on terror, I mean, you seem like you went through really quite an evolution seeing these things firsthand. You write in One Day of the West of what you saw during the war on terror. This is a quote. You said, "I saw the terrible wrath of the place, saw it obliterate hundreds of thousands of people with names and ethnicities and religion like mine. Knew for certain that there were deep, ugly cracks at the bedrock of this thing called the free world, and yet I believed the cracks could be fixed, that the thing at the core, whatever it was salvageable until the fall of 2023, until the slaughter." That was the moment at which you decided that the values of the West were no longer sustainable when pitted against the reality that you were witnessing.
I think so. And I think if I was less oblivious, maybe that moment would have come sooner, but it didn't. The way I tend to think about it is sort of like how Hemingway's characters go bankrupt, little by little and then all at once.
All at once,
right.
Yeah, right. Right.
You see these things in Afghanistan, in Guantanamo Bay, in the United States itself, in the West, and you're able to compartmentalize them. You're able to see a thing maybe for what it is, but say, this is happening in this moment and under these extreme circumstances, and that's the container it lives in. And then you see the last year and a half and all those containers come apart. And that's sort of what happened for me.
Yeah, I think this is why I found that quote so interesting. And my reaction to it, and again, I mean, with apologies, I know this is a hard question, but it occurred to me, why did it take you so long to know? It seems to me that you lived through the war on terror, you lived through the two wars in Iraq, you saw firsthand the result of the war on terror, you saw firsthand some of the worst excesses of the West in Guantanamo Bay, and yet all the way into the autumn of 2023 you believe in this edifice. August 2023 you believe in it, September 2023 you believe in it, even October 2023 you believe in it, and then at some point there's a rupture. Why did it take you so long to see the rupture?
I think the short answer is because I'm a coward. You're looking at years spent on the front lines of exactly the kind of situation you're describing, these moments in history that you're describing. And I can't separate that from the reality that in the process of intimately observing these events, these moments, these tides of history, I was making a name for myself and I was finding a place for myself. And, you write these stories and you win journalism awards for them. But that was, I think, at the subconscious level, the magnetic factor that is keeping me tied to this position. But the conscious factor is that you still believe that you can use the tools of the system to change the system. And in fact, in journalism, that has to be a kind of belief, right? You have to believe that that story maybe will make it into the paper and will make it onto Parliament Hill and somebody important will read it and you might affect change through the mechanism. And I think that's what's changed for me, is that I no longer believe that the mechanisms as they stand can be used to change the mechanisms, which, as I say, it sounds like the most ridiculously obvious thing. But when you are being continuously rewarded for it, it's a much easier thing to believe.
Well, you've been incredibly honest in this conversation, and you know, I recognize that it is a very difficult thing to be pushed so hard on some of these topics, especially when you've come up with answers that pertain to your own personal beliefs. I mean, calling yourself a coward, when I'm sure you are not, is a very hard thing to do. So I think it's a testimony to your intellectual capacity that you're able to go that far. I wonder if part of the reason that you held on to the what sometimes you hear called the master's tools so long is that you were comparing it to some of your own experiences in other countries, in particular the country of your background, Egypt. And that when we see the reality of some of those countries, we kind of have to assume that actually there is a better place. And when you get to that better place, you say it must be real because we're juxtaposing it against the experiences we had elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question. It's a fascinating thing to think about because I don't think that my views about the part of the world I come from have changed all that much over the years. You know,
that's interesting.
There's a reason I didn't write this book about Egypt. You know, I know the politics of that place, and I know what they've been for essentially my entire lifetime. You know, I was recently back in Qatar. I was teaching there last November. And it's strange because Qatar is where I spent my formative years. I was there from the ages of 5 to 16, which are, you know, pretty important years.
Big years, yeah.
And so I go back and simultaneously it's a place where I feel the most comfortable and the least comfortable in my own skin, which is a very weird sensation to have.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about it because if you go back even 2 years ago and you ask me, what would it take to get you to move back to Qatar? I would tell you nothing. There's nothing you can offer me. There's no salary. There's no set of benefits that would bring me back. And for the first time in my life, I'm considering that question. I'm reconsidering it. And it's not because my feelings about Qatar have changed. I think what this comes down to, and this is not just in response to this question, but to everything we've talked about, is that for the last year and a half, I've watched the worst things human beings can do to one another. I listened to a little girl beg for her life before she was shot 355 times. I watched a little girl starve to death. I watched parents bury the limbs of their children because that's all they could find. And I'm not the same person on the other side of that. And I realize how trivial and pathetic it is to be sitting in the safe part of the world and saying this when other people are undergoing immense suffering, but that doesn't make it untrue. And so what I'm left with, essentially, is just a sense of what to do with myself when I exist in a society whose power centers are telling me that I have to abide all of this or else I'm the bad person.
You're the problem, yeah.
That is quite simply on a social level, on an emotional level, on a psychological level, untenable for me. And so when I talk about the defining aftertaste of this book being uncertainty, that's what I'm talking about. I've become untethered from something I believed in for a very long time, and I don't know who the hell I am on the other side of that.
I want to end by talking about the world that will emerge after Gaza. There have been a series of books that have seen the Gaza war as a rupture and have tried to imagine what the world might look like after it. Most prominently, I think, is Pankaj Mishra's book, The World After Gaza. But you also see this in Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Message, Peter Beinart's Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, and yours as well. What do you think the world will look like after this moral rupture in Gaza?
I think, and again, I live in the U.S. where it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone many years from now. But my sense is that we're watching the last days of a particularly ineffectual kind of centrism. that can no longer function as even a performative kind of resistance to the outright fascism that is slowly taking over so many of the most powerful nations and institutions on earth. And so my sense is that we are either in for years of slaughter that make even the last year and a half in Gaza look tame by comparison, which is a horrifying thing to imagine, or we are in for a method of resistance and a politics of resistance that is at least possessed of a spine, because God knows that wearing a pink suit jacket to the State of the Union address is not the kind of resistance we need right now. I think we're at a fork in the road, and I think that we are leaning towards something very, very dark. And unless people are actually willing to risk standing up to it, we are in for an incredibly dark next few years.
Omar El Akkad, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. You can buy Omar's book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.